Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi.
And I'm Zara.
Over the past few months, you may have seen headlines that 2 astronauts are currently stuck in space. Now, to be clear, NASA and Boeing have really tried to deny that these astronauts are stuck or stranded or whatever word you want to use that implies they aren't able to leave. But we do know one thing. The 2 astronauts were only meant to be in space for 8 days, but now they will be there for at least 8 months. So how did all of this unfold? We are going to get to the bottom of it in today's deep dive.
So, Billi, I have completely and utterly missed this story. And normally that would be because I have just not had time to read up on it. I have actively ignored this story because, and so I'm so glad we're doing a full podcast, because it makes me feel so claustrophobic thinking about this story. However, I'm going to let you indulge and let me know a bit about these astronauts who are stuck in space. But for people like me who perhaps have been keeping away from this story, whether consciously or subconsciously, what have they missed?
I fear I'm only going to make you feel more claustrophobic.
Excellent.
But hopefully not. Okay, so this all starts with Boeing, who you will likely recognize as the US plane manufacturer, who are behind many of the world's commercial flights. Now, as you probably know, they have had a bit of a rough year.
It's a euphemism.
Yes. A door on one of their aircrafts fell off. They also had their CEO quit. They've just been at the centre of several different stories, mainly around safety concerns of their aircrafts. Now, the reason that we are talking about them today is because of what they're trying to do in space. So this whole thing revolves around Boeing wanting to test their first crewed spacecraft. So they wanted to send people into space on one of their own spacecrafts for the first time. And the intention of the launch was to test if Boeing's spacecraft, which is called Starliner, could become a safe, reliable and sustainable way to get to the International Space Station.
I don't want to get too stuck into this, but I would say that it has to be said. Someone has to say that they have been in the news a lot this year because of safety on Earth, and now they are in the news for safety in space. And that, I'll just leave that there and move on.
If someone had to say it, I'm glad it was you and not me.
Okay, but you mentioned there the International Space Station. What is that?
Yeah, some people might not be too familiar with the International Space Station because it's certainly not close to home for any of us. So it's basically just a really large spacecraft that orbits Earth. I saw a fact before that it orbits Earth every 90 minutes.
Wow.
So it's going very fast, very, very fast. And it is where astronauts basically just live in space. It's as big as a football field and it can house a crew of 6 people plus visitors. So quite really large. And it's like they basically eat there, they sleep there, they go to the toilet there, they can go to the gym there. Like it's basically its own little community.
Yeah.
And people have been living there in space since the first crew arrived in 2000.
Okay, and so Boeing is sending their first crewed spacecraft there. Who are the people on board this spacecraft?
So there were 2 astronauts on board. Their names are Barry Wilmore, who is also known as Butch, and also Sunita Williams. They are NASA astronauts. So essentially Boeing provides the spacecraft and NASA provides the astronauts.
Makes sense.
And this is both of their 3rd times venturing to the International Space Station. So they're basically veterans of the industry. Now, this story actually begins a long time ago. NASA first awarded a contract to Boeing in 2014, so 10 years ago, to provide crew transport vehicles to the International Space Station. Now, there have been lots of things that have happened in the past decade, but we're going to pick the story up this year when the Starliner was first meant to launch in May. Now, that launch failed. And it was then followed by a second launch attempt on the 1st of June, and that also failed. But then on the 5th of June, so we're talking 5th of June this year, the launch was finally successful.
3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying 2 American heroes.
And the astronauts landed at the International Space Station just days after they launched, and it was live streamed at the time.
Lots of cheering here in the room, big hugs. Sunny William coming through in her blue flight suit. Oh,
and followed shortly behind by Commander of Starliner Butch Wilmore, now back on the space station, the third visit for both astronauts and the first crewed flight test of the Starliner spacecraft.
I wish listeners could see the footage of them arriving at the International Space Station. You can literally just see how happy they are to have safely arrived. They're literally dancing, they're snapping their fingers, they're being embraced by... Listeners can't see, but Zara just decided to snap her fingers.
Just needed a visual cue.
They are being embraced by the astronauts who are already there. And it was just a really joyous moment. And they looked quite relieved, again, to arrive safely. Now, at this stage, Sunita and Butch thought that they would be there for about a week. Spoiler, they were not.
Okay, so I haven't felt claustrophobic at any point yet, but I fear that we are entering that territory very soon. How long after that moment that you just played did these two astronauts first understand that something wasn't right?
I mean, I think the whole time it always kind of seemed like nothing was kind of going to plan for Boeing. Like I said before, they had 2 failed launches before they were even able to leave Earth. And that's only this year. There have been several issues in the past decade. But when they were on their way from Earth to the International Space Station, more issues arose. So whilst they were traveling, NASA and Boeing identified helium leaks and also issues with the reaction control thrusters. Now, full transparency, you might not know this, Zara, but I'm actually not an engineer.
It's shocking to me.
So I'm not going to try to explain what exactly that means. But I think all we need to know is it's not good.
Yeah.
It was not safe for them to come home at that point, as was planned. And so their return to Earth starts to get delayed. And then it gets delayed again. And then it got delayed again.
And so it's at that point that the media starts to pick up on this story and starts to report that the astronauts are stuck in space, right?
Yeah, and the media was definitely quick to raise questions about if these astronauts were stuck in space. But NASA and Boeing really quickly denied this. One senior NASA employee, Stephen Hershon, he called it outright sensationalism from the media and said that they were only extending the mission to collect more data. And they basically said journalists are not engineers and so they don't really know what they are talking about. Now, in July, one thing that they did to prove that the astronauts were okay was hold a press conference. They can hold press conferences from space, if you didn't know. So Sunita and Butch took questions from journalists from space.
We've been thoroughly busy up here, integrated right into the crew. And every about once a week, we get to jump into Starliner and talk to our control team there and work through all the new nuances that they're working very hard on the ground to make sure that we will be able to come home before too long.
So again, that was in July. And at that point, they thought that they would be returning within weeks. And they also thought that they would be returning on the Starliner. So the messaging was basically, we're just fixing a few things, but we'll see you soon.
Okay, and so what happened from there?
So next, we're basically going through a timeline here. So then in August, Boeing and NASA announced that the Starliner will be returning home in early September, but without Butch and Sunita. So Butch and Sunita will be staying in space, but the Starliner is
will
coming
not be staying
home.
in space.
And they basically just said, and I'm paraphrasing, this wasn't their exact wording, but they said it wasn't safe for the astronauts to return on the Starliner and that they didn't want to take that risk. So the new plan was for Starliner to come home and then for a different spacecraft, one owned by Elon Musk's SpaceX, would be sent to then pick them up. Now, just days after they announced that, we then find out that one of the astronauts, Butch, he is hearing a weird noise coming from the Starliner.
There's a strange noise coming through the speaker. I don't know what's making it, but I don't know if it's something that maybe is connected between here and there, making that happen.
We can configure that, Butch. Give us a minute and I'll call you back when it's ready. All right, Butch, that one came through.
So eerie. I feel like if I was at home by myself and I heard that,
That is torture.
I would hate that. Imagine being in space and hearing that.
That's like when a fire alarm goes off in your office, but it's not a real emergency and then you just have to sit through it. That's what that sounds like.
Yeah, but I imagine that's why they are probably astronauts, because they're probably calm in those situations.
Probably.
Now, NASA later said about a week later that the noise had stopped and that it was common to experience noise, and they basically said there weren't any large concerns there.
I must say that, I think for us, this all feels so novel and so new, but, these people spend their whole lives preparing for experiences like this. And we now just have so much more access and so much more information, to be able to hear sounds like that. When I'm sure astronauts have been hearing that, every time, or at least some of the time. I do want to just pick back up on the timeline that you were mentioning. So you said that the astronauts were going to be staying in space, but the Starliner was going to be returning. Has it returned yet?
Yeah, literally this week, the Starliner arrived safely back on Earth in New Mexico.
Starliner has touched down out there at White Sands in New Mexico after its extended stay at the International Space Station.
So Starliner safely landed, but the astronauts, they are still in space.
If someone's not been listening to this whole podcast and they're, starting to focus just now at the very end, is the too long didn't read of this podcast that the astronauts are stuck in space?
I mean, I think it literally depends what your definition of stuck is.
My definition of stuck is being in space with no way of getting back.
Yeah, I mean, NASA absolutely...
Maybe that's narrow-minded.
I mean, NASA absolutely has not used that language or anything close to it. And they are still kind of just saying that the media is blowing this out of proportion, and they're saying that this was always a test and that tests are never completely safe and that they were kind of prepared for this.
I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, though, if I was sent on a work trip for 8 days and I wasn't able to come home for 8 months, you bet I would be saying I was stuck.
It would be a bit inconvenient for us too.
Yeah. But I'd be saying I was stranded, whatever word describes that I'm not able to come home. Like, I literally cannot get home.
But those astronauts, they aren't using that language either. So maybe it's us normies on Earth who are like projecting onto these people who fully understand the risks that they have taken and are okay with how it's played out.
Yeah, it's us normies, but also maybe just us journalists in the media, like you and I, Zara. I think NASA would say that we're part of the problem.
On that note, are we expecting them still to return in February?
Yeah, that's absolutely the plan, for them to be home early next year. I think no matter what, whenever they do get home and when they do safely return home, there will be a very warm welcome for them.
That's for sure. And Billi, thank you for explaining that in a way that didn't make me feel deeply uncomfortable.
Perfect. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus, whether you're on Apple or Spotify, or if you're watching us on YouTube, where we post all of our podcasts now. We are currently running a survey to understand what it is that you like about our podcast, but also what are the things that you think we could improve on. The link to that is in today's show notes, and we would so appreciate if you could fill it out. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back again tomorrow.